Welcome to the segment of the show we call Hellbent for Horrible Questions, where I invite guests on to talk about their art and answer some horrible, horrible questions. On Saturday, June 29th, the Egyptian Theater in Los Angeles will host Etheria Film Night. Now, Etheria screens the best new science fiction, fantasy, action, thriller, comedy, and horror films, in other words, genre films, directed by women. And leading up to that event, I'll be interviewing some of the filmmakers whose films are up for the audience and the jury awards. Today, I'm with director Sarah K. Reimers about her short film, Bitten. Sarah, thank you so much for being on Hellbent for Horrible Questions.
I'm so happy to be here, Scott. Thanks for having me.
Can you give a brief synopsis of Bitten? I know it's always hard with a short film. You don't want to give away surprises, but can you give us a little bit of a twist?
Well, Bitten is about a woman and her dog who live together, and they both have an evening of adventure. She goes out sort of in on the hunt for her prey, and he goes off and has sort of a violent encounter with a mysterious creature, and it changes his whole night. And he goes out and they come back together, and I will stop there.
Sounds like a very wise place to stop. So I got to see Bitten at the Women in Horror Film Festival, and it was a real crowd pleaser. And what I liked about the film was how you used comedy and horror mixed together as a hybrid to really talk about a story that essentially looks at loneliness and the hunger for connection. And yet you turn that into a joyous viewing experience. So what was the tightrope walk that you were going for there?
You know, the part that was the trickiest was the music and trying to find where to take the shift from horror to comedy and where the right spot to do that was. That turned out to be far trickier than I was anticipating it would be. And we spent a lot of time, like with my composer, Barney Jones, just working that out. What was the sound? How do you find that middle ground? It was tricky.
So you had another tricky thing with the storyline. There's kind of a balancing act that's going on because the story centers around coupling, and we'll just keep that secret here. But you have a coupling that if it was shown in just a slightly different light, it would disturb people instead of entertain people. So how did you come to that storyline without giving anything away? And how did you go, I can work around it in this fashion?
You know, I was actually really uncomfortable with that part of the storyline. I resisted it for a long time. And my co-writer and I, Emma Coates, she said it was her idea and you've got to do this. And I think maybe I was uncomfortable with it because we were going to use my dog and
Iggy.
And yeah, Iggy. And the story actually resonated really deeply for me in what the woman's storyline was and what she was going through. And so it just made me uncomfortable. I was just like, that's no. And I talked to a couple other of my friends and people I look up to creatively, and they're like, you have to do that. You just have to. And it just wasn't ever in the conversation that we were going to show more than we ever did show. That was sort of, I'm a big fan of leaving a lot to the imagination, of leaving things off screen, doing things with sound, giving impressions of things. I think it's far more impactful to let the audience fill in the blanks. And since I was already a little bit squeamish about that, it was just a done deal.
Well, I thought it was really fun, and I really appreciated the acting in this. I did not know either of the key actors that were in it by name. Their faces seem vaguely familiar, but I'm not even sure. Have they worked before in film?
Francine Torres, yes. She's done web series and short films. I'm not sure if she's done any feature work, but she teaches acting. She was in San Francisco, so she was at ACT for a while. She was most recently at Stanford, and then she is in the process right now of going to Tisch in New York to teach acting. And she improv'd most of those lines.
I thought so.
I gave her sort of like, this is what this moment is about, and this is what you're communicating. She is dreadfully allergic to dogs too. So we had to sort of limit the proximity she had to Iggy. And then she just ran with it. and she ran with it take after take, and it was really hard to pare it down. She was fantastic, and she carries the energy, I think. And Michael Curran had never done any acting before, and he's a contortionist. He's in the circus arts world.
Of course.
That was, finding someone for that role was tricky, and we weren't sure how to go about casting that. And my producer, Kim Donovan, had the brilliant idea of going into the dance community, going towards people who would be comfortable in their bodies, comfortable being awkward in the way they held their bodies. And I'll stop with the other parts they had to be comfortable with.
Right.
And it was his first time. He took it really serious, and he really researched it and tried to embody what a dog would be like. And I was really, really happy. And he was comfortable on set. Like, he just threw himself into it.
Yeah, and on location. I was like, wow, those look like stolen shots that look fantastic for stolen shots. And being someone in the Bay Area, knowing some of the backyards, how they look and everything, but it's a wonderful, hilarious, joyous moment, because there are dogs coming up to the fences, barking at him in the background, which works. And so for those that haven't seen it, there is a role in here where it's basically mime. The character is doing something where it is all body, no voice. And it's very impressive and probably hard to direct and probably hard to edit around. I would think that between that and what I loved about Torres's part, and why I thought there was this bit of improv, is that I'm a dog owner too, who tends to speak to their dog, especially when they're alone. And it felt very real, but it wasn't just that it was real. It helped propel things forward. So there was a constant, what I was really impressed by with this film when looking at it against other films in categories was how much the narrative flow just continued seamlessly, and how the sense of place, room to room, made geographic sense. And that sometimes the thing that was doing that was the performance, not just moving to the left or moving to the right, but it was kind of like the voice and what they're talking about just kind of move things forward to where you're kind of lulled into this pace that the film had. So I thought that was really, really exciting. All comedy aside, what's the most important thing that you hope audiences come away with from Bitten?
Well, I want them to be entertained. I really just want them to laugh. I want them to have that, like, what moment, and like that's really it. At the end of it, it is about loneliness. It made me really happy that you said that, because that I don't go into my film projects with a message. I usually figure out what it is. It's like a therapy session. At the end, you're like, okay, so I was working through my feelings about this. I wanted to make that film because I wanted to make a film with Iggy, because he was so talented and he was getting on in years, and I loved werewolves. I just wanted to do this, and I want to entertain people. I love to be entertained, and I love entertaining. So that's, I think, what's important to me. When someone like you comes along and like sees through that layer of just laughter and sort of shock and absurdity, and sees that there's maybe some serious emotion and processing going on, that's gravy, and that makes me really happy.
Well, I think I kind of fall with the thing that I believe it was Tobe Hooper said, where he said, you make these movies, then 20 years later you figure out what it was all about. And I think that's part of art. I don't see it like you have to come in with a message. The message is already there because you're living in this planet and going through whatever is happening. And I loved the scene where she's yelling at the Uber guy walking back to the house drunk, or she's trying to pick up the Uber guy. And that's where I was like, this is great. This is funny, but what a sad moment. Really, she's defeated. The night is defeated, and she's come back and she's taking one last stab at this Uber driver, but she's doing it with such broad dignity, like this outrage of being, once again, you don't want me, I think is the words that she uses. And that's when I went, wow, that's a powerful thing. So I love that there's a theme that is underlying for just about any artist when they're doing this. And I know that Bitten's your first directorial work,
yes,
right?
Yes.
which is really amazing. But you've been an editor for a while. You've been editing films and TV.
Yeah.
You did Pixar movies, Brave and Finding Dory and Coco, right?
I worked a bit on Coco. I edited their the short film Piper as well.
Oh, okay, great. See, so you have quite a few. You get an understanding of film language, obviously, if you're an editor. So there's a great narrative flow. I mentioned that, and the sense of pace. So when
That comes from my animation background. This not to break in, but this was made through the Pixar co-op film program. So most of I'd say 98% of the crew were Pixar employees. And so they have gear and a program in place to sort of allow us to make films on the side and sort of develop our craft and get better and try different roles out. So I did have, in the production part of it, there were people who were outside of their normal comfort zone. But for the post-production, those were my people. So I was working with, my editor, Nick Smith, edited Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula. My composer has worked on a ton of films. My sound mixer is got the most impressive IMDb resume you've ever seen. I kind of had like a crack post team, but they were all my friends, so it was fun. But that's a lot of you were mentioning the flow of the narrative. I storyboarded it. When I started it, I storyboarded, and I approach everything with sort of an editor's eye of how do we cut from scene to scene? What is the movement? What is the story? And I sat down with my editors and my camera guy, who, was also he does art and layout at Pixar. And we just talked about, does this feel like it flows? Does this all make sense? And when it's organized in that way, then you can just let the actors play. So Francine was really free because it had all been sort of structured and laid out to just bring what she brought to it. And she took a character that for me was sort of sad and my worst nightmare, and gave it this, like you said, dignity and life and energy that was her contribution, that I hadn't seen that possibility in that character, and it totally sells it.
Oh, yeah. So the editor's eye you mentioned, and I love that, like Hal Ashby was a great editor who ended up being a director and did all this stuff. And sometimes he got dinged for being an editor. It was always funny in the reviews. They'd go, "Oh, well, it's the composition, and he just doesn't have the soul." And I'm like, that just sounds like horseshit. The only thing that I can think of that is a difference is whether or not you are taking in more coverage or less coverage because of how you're looking at shots. So do you find as a editor, do you shoot more coverage or less when you're on the set, especially once you've storyboarded everything?
I shoot less, but I don't think that's a good thing. I think that's part of my growth as a director. Plus, when you're working on these low budget things, you're working a lot of time. I'm constrained. I've got budget constraints. I've got time constraints. I've got people's time on the weekends away from their day jobs. So I'm really economical about how I go about it. But I think as I get bigger budgets and more resources, I'm going to have to be more comfortable with being a little looser and getting more coverage. I think I'm going to have to peel off of being an editor and not wanting to have to go through hours and hours and hours of footage, because I think when as a director, you actually want to have more options when you get in the cutting room.
Right. So as you keep making films, do you find yourself drawn to certain types of stories or themes or images that make it into your films?
I'm really attracted to, let me rephrase that. I keep getting drawn to stories about children and children, animals. The projects I've got in development right now are, one's a comedy, one's straight horror, and they both feature children, usually the Midwest where I'm from. There's something about that sort of preteen time of life that I think where you're straddling adulthood and not even adulthood, but you're straddling being so self-aware as a teenager, but being completely free and imaginative as a child, that I think is a really special place that allows for imagination in peril. At the same time, you're not tied to your parents' arm, but you're, maybe not quite ready to make good judgment. So that's that's sort of where I keep ending up. And I tend to go with weirder. I like absurd, strange things. I like mundane situations that have that twist, and suddenly you go, what? But that could, I try to ground it in that it could happen. I try to set up this world where everything could be this way. It could be this way, and then all of a sudden there's a twist, and you're thrown off. And in my head, it is that way, so I try to convey that to
right. Kind of like when you were sitting there saying, the thing between adulthood and your childhood is where you make bad decisions. I'm like, I'm too old to not call myself an adult now. So if bad decisions are the way to adulthood, I'm screwed. So Bitten won the Best Horror and Comedy Short at the Women in Horror Film Festival and the Hexploitation Film Festival as well. And it also won the Audience Award at the Coven Film Festival. Now your work's going to get screened at Etheria on June 29th. As an artist and as a guest, what do you hope to experience when you go to film festivals?
This was my first year and my first film in festivals, so I've been learning by doing, and so I didn't know what to expect. Through my work, I've spent days sitting in theaters watching something, but not like this. And so my expectations have changed and my approach has changed. I didn't go into this realizing how important the connections with other filmmakers would be, and that there was this community of genre film festivals that are connected to each other. People are friends. People go to the same festivals year after year. Even if they don't have a film in it, they go to be with this group of people that they don't maybe geographically live near, but they communicate on social media and they support each other. And it's been fascinating to be, a freshman in that world and meet these people. Because I come from, the film industry, but I had no idea that there was this community. So I've learned that that's really important. And probably what I value the most out of the festival experience at this point is really, I love seeing the films. That's just fun. But what you walk away with are these connections to people from all over the world that you just wouldn't have run into or bumped up against any other way.
Right. We call it convention family. I have a group of people that I see at horror festivals and at horror conventions. And that's one of the ways that I say that genre, especially horror, it can make you happy and healthy. If you have a community, if you've got a way to express yourself artistically, if you get to deal with things that normally would just have to be stuck inside of you and be able to handshake with that shadow side, how can you not be happier? So I'm welcome to the fold, as one might say. So
thank you.
Bitten is a horror and comedy hybrid. Of course, that's genre work. Now, are you a fan of genre films, or is it more that you're trying them out to find out what really interests you?
I am a lifelong horror fan. Lifelong. I love it so much. So very much.
So what was your first kiss with horror? What was the movie that turned you into a junkie or made you go down this horrible path of a life?
It wasn't one movie. It was a TV series. So in Detroit, there were two television stations that would run Saturday afternoon. There was the TV20 Thriller double feature and the Channel 50 Shocker. And so after Saturday morning cartoons, you could then just roll right into these like Hammer film, like cult films that were just really like 70s and 80s B horror films that were amazing. And I think it was Taste the Blood of Dracula. Mm-hmm. That like, I was 9 years old when I saw that on TV, and I was like, what? His eyes turned red, and I think I was sitting under the kitchen table, like with the chair, like through the kitchen chair legs, just like, wow, why is someone letting me watch this? That stuck with me. And Tourist Trap.
One of my favorites. So underrated, that movie.
I just rewatched it the other day when I was a small one watching that, and like doing the plastering, and he's like, you'll die of fear. Your heart will burst from fear before you'll suffocate. And that one, that never leaves you.
Oh yeah. That surreal opening with them walking into that gas station. There's just this weird stuff like a pipe that just keeps rattling on the ground. And then these weird disembodied mannequin heads. It creeped me out so bad. And I still think that movie has, it hits on that uncanny valley fear that we have where things are not quite human and they are. And, it's the one Charles Band film that I will champion forever and ever. I think it was his first, but it was really good. And what was your horror host? Since you're talking about Saturday morning or Saturday evening or Friday night horror shows.
Well, I mean, the Saturday afternoon one, they just had this voiceover that was like, welcome. And I think it was the TV station manager who did that. And then it wasn't, because then there was the Tales from the Crypt guy in the evenings. Because then there was Saturday night. When I got a little older and I could stay up later, my best friend and I would stay up and watch the Friday the 13th television series, which then rolled into the Tales from the Crypt show with the Crypt Master. That was, and I think we saw, I had a little Elvira in my life. But yeah, all that, I mean, that's what we did. And we'd march ourselves down the block to the video store and we would just go down the aisle with all the horror movies and just pick one. I think I went through every single film they had, the Howling series.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. I have a vintage Howling movie poster that is my pride and joy.
Oh,
it's
awesome.
Just being able to go and Pumpkinhead and Howling and Devil's Reign, oh, so good. And just having it I think having that stuff on Saturday afternoons on two different stations that were kind of competing against each other for viewers, I think it got under a lot of Detroit kids' skins. But I mean, there was a lot of us who grew up that way and fell in love with it.
Oh yeah, there's a whole network of people across the country who grew up at a certain time when their news station or their television station had either a Friday evening or Saturday evening creature features thing, and they had their horror host. And those horror hosts are considered legendary. There were a few in Detroit. Midwest was full of them. And I was from Pennsylvania, and we had a guy named Uncle Ted. His show was Uncle Ted's Ghoul School. And it was a failed magician who wore a fez and a really big handlebar mustache, and you just do terrible magic acts and then go, and now we'll go back to the movie. It's as lovingly close to Count Floyd from SCTV as you possibly could be. But, it was wonderful for the time that I was a child. He scared the heck out of me with movies that, when I look at them now, are not terribly scary. They all came from the same group of movies that they were allowed to show, but it was still such a formative bit. Now, you talked about being a horror fan, lifelong horror fan. When you hear the word horror, what do you associate with it? What's your definition?
Well, I think it's that, for me, the horror means that you're going into it to be scared. So it's anything that, makes you frightened. And that changes from person to person. I'm big with monsters and the supernatural. That's what I do. But there's, then there's the genre of the slashers and the torture porn. And that's a whole different group. And I've watched a lot. I've watched most of it. But for me, I go for the more intangible, more chaotic, the supernatural, where basically it's not human against human. It's human against the unbelievable.
Right.
I don't know if I answered your question, but
I think what you said that's so important, to me at least, is that horror is thoroughly subjective. It is an open door. And why I look at horror in a very broad fashion. I try to even stay away from genre terms if I can, because I think that sometimes that's limiting. And I think the thing that's amazing about horror, what's so beautiful about it to me, is that it is immeasurably flexible to a story. It can basically work in any genre. It's like a great ingredient on any soup, and it is perfect for allegory and metaphor. So when you're saying person against person, sometimes it's person against personal issue. You have something, a social concern, and you're not going to get that without it being incredibly stilted or obvious on the top soil, whereas horror allows you to do that on the sub level. So I kind of like that. Now, so we're horror guys, right? So most people, average, normal people, they have a guilty pleasure. Sometimes it ends up being a horror movie, but we're horror people. So what is your guilty pleasure? What's the movie that you love that is so not like what you normally watch?
There's a few. You know, my guilty pleasure, and I don't know if, I mean, I think a lot of people stand by it, but when I'm in the dumps, I watch Office Space. That is when I am depressed, Office Space brings me up. But in a way, it's about the horror of being trapped in a bad job and in in a beige world of bureaucracy and cubicles. So it's outside of my horror library and my animation library, you know, and it's maybe a little, you know, it's fluff, but that one, when they're beating the crap out of that printer in the middle of the field with like the heavy gangster rap happening, that does it for me. I'm like, yes.
That's awesome. And look at this. Believe it or not, you survived it. You survived the horrible questions that I had. I've expended all of my horrible questions. Thank you so much for being on Hellbent for Horror, Sarah K. Reimers, and thank you for your film, Bitten. Can you tell us where people can see Bitten, where they can go to keep up with your work?
I have a website, bestbaddogfilms.com, that sort of will keep you up to date on all the different projects that I've got out there. Bitten is in festivals, so it's not available to watch online. There's a trailer, though, and you can find that through the website. And it might be, you know, part of some things that might be coming out on that I can't really talk about yet. And it's got more festivals that it's coming to that I can't talk about yet. But if you follow Best Bad Dog Films, you can keep up with all the strange things that I do, and Bitten.
And how about family recipes?
Family recipes. Yeah. Family recipes just came out a few weeks ago. It's 5 episodes, and that is on YouTube right now. And you can track that through the Best Bad Dog Films website as well. And that is a comedy cooking show. I like to mix my genres and make things really hard to categorize. But that is my best friend, who is also my partner in horror movies from way back in the day. She's the one we watched all our horror movies together, and you might watch the show and see us sporting some gear from time to time. And we go through her family cookbook, which is her real family cookbook, and it's 70s and 80s Midwestern recipes.
Oh my.
And she has a deep nostalgia for these recipes and is completely unobjective about them. And I am the bad cop who says, no.
Marshmallows?
Lots of nothing. It comes in a bag, a can, or a box. So we take 5 minutes of your time to go through and make this recipe. And you hear us just give each other shit and talk smack to each other and roll our eyes at each other and then figure out if this recipe is edible. It's usually not. She loves them, though. So that's a fun one. It's just straight comedy, but sort of the horror of bad Midwestern 80s cooking.
Well, thanks again so much for being on the show, Sarah K. Reimers. And I want to thank everybody for listening as well. And until next time, stay hellbent.